What is going on, everyone? Today we're going to be walking through about 15 of some of my favorite images, not only walking through how I edit them, but kind of like the thought process around the edit. I'll also kind of dive through how some of these images were taken, though we won't spend too much time on that aspect of it as well. But we're also going to be talking about my new preset pack that recently came out. So before we start actually diving into the live edit of these images, I want to really quickly walk through what my preset pack is, kind of the idea around the naming conventions, as well as walk through all of the different tools that it comes with and what they do. And then we'll dive into the live edit and I'll actually show how I use these tools in some of these images. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into Lightroom, and I'm going to walk through first what comes with the preset pack. And so the name of the preset pack is called the Grandmaster Series. It's got like a chess theme to it because I am a big fan of playing chess, even though I'm not very good at it. But the Grandmaster Series is going to include 2 color presets and a black and white. Now, the main preset that I use for almost everything is going to be the Queen's Gambit. And so if I click on this, this will be the Queen's Gambit. Let's pump up this exposure just a little bit. And so this will be kind of what the Queen's Gambit looks like. I'm a big fan of what the skin tones are doing, but sometimes it can be a little bit too punchy, especially for like a general user or for a general edit across maybe like, maybe you're just editing some family photos or something like that and you don't want something so in your face. And so with that, we have Queen's Gambit Decline. And so what Queen's Gambit Decline is going to be is it's going to be a little bit more neutral, a little less contrasty, and especially within the shadows of the skin tones, you'll notice that Queen's Gambit can sometimes get a little bit oversaturated and a little bit too warm. And so that's where Queen's Gambit Decline comes in. So this would be what Queen's Gambit Decline is. Now, within both of Queen's Gambit and Queen's Gambit Decline, you have a profile slider, and it's just called VI. Now, what this can be looked at as the kind of like the foundation of the color for this preset pack. And so if I were to crank this all the way up, the image gets warmer. And if I drag it all the way down, it gets cooler. Now, this is not to be confused with the white balance slider, because obviously if I drag up and down the white balance slider, the image is going to get warmer and cooler, but it's handled differently. And so think about this as like the tones of the image are going to be a little bit warmer instead of just like the overall white balance. And so for me, Queen's Gambit Decline comes in with a default of, I think, 50%. I usually like Queen's Gambit Decline to be more in, like the 90 to 100 range. But you can kind of play around with what you like as far as the tones go, and set your own custom preset if that's what you'd like. From here, we have a black and white. Now, the black and white is called the Caro-Con. And so this is a nice contrasty black and white, but I wanted to make sure that there was a decent amount of dynamic range, and I didn't want to clip my highlights and clip my shadows. And so instead of having kind of this like tonality profile on the black and white, since obviously it's black and white, we don't have that ability. What the slider does now is it gives you the ability to add contrast without clipping blacks and whites. Because normally if I just like crank the contrast slider all the way up, that's when you'll start seeing whites and blacks start to be clipped. And so this contrast slider lets me add contrast without clipping blacks and whites. So it's a really nice way to add a little bit of punchiness without having to deal with some of those drawbacks. Now from here we have the contrast curve negative, which gives you a little bit less contrast in terms of the curve. You have a plus, which gives you obviously more. And then we have dynamic range plus, which just kind of maximizes the dynamic range of the image. And then we have white balance cool, white balance warm. And again, this isn't to be confused with the white balance slider. Again, this is just the tonality of the image. And so if I were to apply Queen's Gambit cool essentially drops this amount slider all the way down, and Queen's Gambit warm raises it all the way to the top. And so it's just a quick way to adjust this slider to the minimum and maximum. But obviously, no matter what, you have the ability to come in here and you can dial this down by the smallest of integers if that's what you would like to do. So that's kind of like the packet as a whole in terms of overall edits. Now we also have this quick burn section. So the quick burn section has a bunch of arrows and then 3 AI subject masking options. Now the arrows can obviously be used within this panel. And so if you think about the arrows, it would be if you were to take a gradient and go in the direction of the area of the arrow, that's how it's going to burn the image. And so bottom up is just going to be a gradient from the bottom up to the right. It's going to be just kind of that corner, and likewise. So you can quickly specific parts of the image very quickly. Now the way that I use this is that I use these arrows specifically only for when I am bulk editing. And when I am bulk editing, I'm trying to keep my hands on my loop deck the entire time. And I found that there were images that could benefit from a quick gradient burn. But in order to save time, I didn't want to have to keep taking my hand off the mouse, off the loop deck and onto my mouse, and then opening the masking tool and then dragging gradients and bringing exposure down. And so what this does is I actually have all of these arrows programmed to the little touch buttons on my loop deck. And so while I'm editing, I don't even need to really look at the arrows, because the square of the loop deck kind of signifies where I'm going to burn. So if I want to burn the top corner, I push this top button. If I want to burn this edge, I burn the edge. And if I want to burn the bottom, I burn the bottom. So that's just a quick and easy way to add a little bit more tender love and care to the images that you would generally just kind of like blow through for a general edit in terms of just like preset white balance and exposure. Okay, moving along, we have 3 AI subjects burn options here. So we have background burn AI, which is going to separate the subject from the background and then burn the background down. And real quick, I'm going to apply this, even though this image doesn't necessarily need it, but the background burn AI is actually broken up into 2 separate parts. And so what it does is it separates the subject from the background. But sometimes that can look a little bit cut and paste-ish, where it's too separated. And so what this brush has, or this AI burn has, is it has 2 separate parts where it separates the subject from the background, but then it also adds this like radial gradient. And so it helps kind of feather the edge out a little bit. And so within this gradient, you can always just drag this gradient around so that it's perfectly centered on your subject, because the default is just to the center of the frame. And if your subject's like way up at the top right, it won't look right. So you'll want to make sure that you just quickly drag this over to wherever your subject is. But if you do want to get rid of this, you could just really quickly just hit the little eyeball and it'll go away. Okay. Next up, we have background pop AI, which is the exact same thing as background burn AI, except instead of burning the background, it's adding a pop, which is just a bunch of saturation, contrast, and things like that. And then we have subject declined AI. So previously, when we were talking about the differences between Queen's Gambit and Queen's Gambit Decline, I found that there were situations where I wanted Queen's Gambit for the image as a whole, but I wanted kind of the skin tones that you got from Queen's Gambit Decline. And so what this gives you the ability to do is you can apply Queen's Gambit, and then you can apply Queen's Gambit Decline. And what this will do is it will separate the subject from the background, and then essentially apply Queen's Gambit Decline only to the subject. Now, the cool thing about this brush is that I find that a lot of the times I want Queen's Gambit Decline, but not so declined, if that makes sense. And so in this situation, you have a slider here where if it's all the way down, then there's nothing. And then you can kind of crank this up as you want. And so you can go even further, or generally I'm in kind of like the 50 to 80% range, where the shadows still do have a little bit of that pop and that saturation. But you have the ability to do that now. Okay. Now, for here, there are also a bunch of local adjustment modifiers. And so if I open up my masking tool and let's just create a new brush, but go into the masking brush presets here. So we have all of these. So there's background pop, but the exact same as the background burn AI, except just in brush form. But blackout, which I have a perfect image for this. But basically I found that there's sometimes parts of an image that I want to just burn all the way to black, but depending on what's in the background, even having the exposure slider all the way down, you have to sometimes stack brushes on top of each other in order to get something to go all the way to black. So what this brush does is just with a single brush, I can burn anything all the way to black. Okay, I have cool burn. Basically, this is a way to darken an area of an image while also adding some cool blue tones to it. I have highlight burn, which is basically just a way to really dial back highlights in an image. I have shadow pull, which is just a way to pull detail out of shadows. But the cool thing about shadow pull is it's not just a simple brush with the shadow slider turned up. It gives you the ability to really draw out details from shadows without affecting highlights and exposure. And so with this brush, you don't have to be very precise and only brush where the shadows are. You can be kind of heavy-handed and just kind of brush in the general area, and it won't affect the highlights and exposure on the outlying areas. It'll only just pull the detail from the shadows. And again, I have a perfect example to kind of show what that does. And then we have warm dodge, similar to cool burn, except I am brightening areas of an image while also adding warm tones. And then last we have whiteout, which is the exact same as blackout, but obviously taking parts of the image all the way to white. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of all of the presets, all of the modifiers that come with the Grandmaster series. So now let's go ahead and dive into editing some specific images. So obviously we've kind of already done this image. There's not a ton that I would do to this. But again, Queen's Gambit looks really good on this. Queen's Gambit Decline looks really good. And Carl Khan also looks really good on this image, which is nice. But moving along, the next image that we're going to do here is going to be this bridal session that I have here. And I'm going to apply Queen's Gambit, and then I am going to raise my exposure up. But I'm looking at kind of this like hotspot on her. And so I want this hotspot to be kind of a hotspot. I don't want it to be kind of like neutral skin tones, but I don't want it to be so hot that it's like overly bright. So something like in this area. But because so much of the skin tones are in shadow, you can see that they are a little bit too saturated. And so again, that's one of the drawbacks of using the Queen's Gambit, is that if there's skin tones that are like in a little bit of the deeper shadow areas, they can get a little oversaturated. So for this specific image, I'm going to do subject decline. And what you'll notice is that the skin tones now look good, but for me, I still want that saturation. So I'm going to open up this subject decline, and I'm actually going to just drop this back a little bit. So this would be without anything. So I'm just going to minimize the saturation about in there. Looks good. The next thing I'm going to do real quick is I am going to just get rid of this little like electric box that was on the side here. There's like some dirty paint. There's an electrical outlet here. This might just be sensor dust or dirty paint. There's no telling. Okay. And now for the image here, this is decent as it is, but for me, the wall and her and the dress, like everything kind of has the same tonality to it. Normally when that happens, I want to try and add some color to kind of spice things up and make the subject pop a little bit more, or I'll take it to black and white. So for this situation, black and white would look good, but I want to keep it as color. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my gradient tool, and I'm going to use Cool Burn, and I'm just going to burn this bottom edge. And so it's just darkening this edge while also adding some warm tone or some cool tones to it. I'm going to get a new gradient, and most of the time when I'm using Cool Burn, I'm also using Warm Dodge. And so I'm going to use Warm Dodge here, and I'm going to drag it from the opposite corner to something like that. And now in this situation, I like what it's doing to the wall, but I don't want it to affect her. So I'm just going to hit subtract subject. Okay, so it takes her off of it. And now that that's happened, she's looking a little bit too cool. So I'm just going to raise the white balance of this a little bit. And maybe this tonality slider a little bit, just to kind of bring it a little bit to something like that. And then a quick little crop to kind of straighten it. and bring her a little closer to this third line. Okay, something like that looks good. Okay. Now, moving along, we've got this image. So I'm going to, again, do Queen's Gambit. I'm going to raise the exposure until they look good. And again, kind of some of these areas that are a little bit oversaturated. So I'm going to do subject decline. I'm going to lower that a little bit to maybe 50% range. Now, I'm also going to do the background burn AI. And because they're centered, the gradient is actually in kind of the perfect space. But if they weren't, I would just drag this gradient to wherever they were. But this would be with the gradient. This is without the gradient. So in this situation, like they look a little bit too separated from the background. And so this gradient just kind of helps blend everything a little bit better together while still darkening the background. Now from here, I like what's going on with this image as far as this left-hand side is kind of cool with the mountains and the lake. But on the right-hand side, we have kind of like the sun flare and the reflected kind of backlit fall leaves over here. So I'm going to kind of dramatize that. And so with my masking tool, I'm going to drag a gradient from the bottom edge here, and I'm going to do a cool burn. So something like that. And I'm going to do another gradient tool with warm dodge from the top corner. So something like that looks good to me. And then I might actually just raise this exposure up just a tad bit more to something like that. Okay. Moving along. This next one is going to be just a little exit they're throwing. I think these are like lavender petals or whatever they are. So I'm going to do Queen's Gambit. I'm going to zoom in on their face so that I'm not getting distracted by all of the other tones and colors around them. And I'm going to adjust my exposure on white balance like that. So mostly after somewhere in this realm. I do still want the image to be really warm because it is. Okay. So this is looking good. I'm going to crop this. I'm going to get rid of this little tint area over here. Something like that. I want to burn down this corner down here. So I'm going to use the cool burn. Something like that. And then again, to go to the opposite side, and I'm going to add a warm dodge. Now there's already like a lot of warmth coming from this sunset, and so this is just going to kind of dramatize that a little bit more. Now you can always use this slider to kind of dial things back or dial things up, but what I like to do is I generally like to keep all the sliders where they are, and what I'll do is I'll just drag the gradient really big, and then I'll just pull the gradient back until it looks good. So somewhere like in there's looking good for me. Okay, moving along. This is an off-camera flash image. This is a bride just up against a white wall. And then I have a flash firing through the slats of a wooden door that kind of has like the slats and stuff so you can block the sun. And I just have them somewhat open. And then I have her set up in an area to where she can see the flash through this open slat right here. So I'm going to do Queen's Gambit. Because her skin tones are darker, they're going to obviously be more saturated. So I'm going to do Queen's Gambit, or the subject decline, and I don't want them that desaturated, so I'm going to lower this a little bit. Be somewhere in that range, looks good to me. Now from here, the exposure on her eyes looks good for where I want it to be. But I want her eyes to be the brightest thing in the frame. And right now that's this area. One, because it's getting a little bit more light, and then two, because it's a white dress. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my brush tool. I'm going to just reset everything here. I'm going to get like a medium flow, big, there we go, big brush. And then I'm going to lower my exposure around tops. And I'm just going to slowly build this up on areas that I want to minimize the brightness. So definitely this little slit here. And maybe up here. Like that is looking good for me. Okay, moving along. This is another off-camera flash image. The light is up against the wall here, so it's firing just directly at her face. I'm gonna do Carl Khan for this one, and then I'm gonna zoom in on her face again and just really look at the exposure and contrast for the subject. So I'm gonna raise the exposure up to something like that. I'm gonna use the contrast slider just to add some contrast to something like that. Maybe bring us down a little bit. No, maybe. I think that looks good to me. Okay, I'm gonna do a quick little crop here. Something like that. And then I'm gonna do subject pop AI or background pop AI, just as a quick way to add the mask. Then I'm going to come in here and open up this mask. I'm just going to reset everything. I'm going to raise the highlights up because I want the subject's or the viewer's eye to go to the subject, but I also want to bring out some of the detail within all of these leaves because that's a very interesting part of the frame. But I don't want to do it so much that that becomes the subject. So I'm going to bring out the highlights, contrast, a little bit of exposure maybe, shadows a little bit. That's coming a little bit too much, maybe not like in that area. And now what you'll notice is that this area is becoming a little bit too bright because it's actually getting some of the light from the flash. And so I'm going to get my brush tool and I'm going to reset it. I'm going to bring my exposure down and I'm just going to brush over this area until it kind of matches the rest of the frame. So something like that. And then I'm going to do a gradient and I'm just going to burn down bottom edge a little bit. Something like that looks good to me. Okay. Moving on. When I first shared the Queen's Gambit preset and, you know, the whole Grandmaster series and stuff, this was an image that I shared and someone had a question about it. And so I threw it in. It's a little bit more of an intense edit. And so it should be kind of fun to watch. But the first thing I'm going to do is apply Queen's Gambit and I'm going to raise my exposure a little bit. I'm going to do dynamic range plus just to kind of bring out all of the detail within the shadows of this chapel. I'm going to do a little bit of a crop and a straighten, which is hard because there's not myself a ton of room, but I don't want to crop off the point of this chapel here. So something maybe in there is going to be good. Now I want to bring out a lot of the detail within this chapel, like all of these arches and stuff like that, as well as bring them out. Now the good thing here is that I backlit them with a flash, and so they have this nice rim light, which is going to make it a lot easier to brush exposure onto them. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a brush and I'm going to reset it and I'm going to raise the exposure up. I'm going to just turn the flow all the way up and brush in all of these little arches here. And I don't want to raise the exposure of the door, and so I'm going to go to my erasing tool and I'm just going to erase some of that edge that kind of bled in. And to brush in just on them, let me lower like feather a little bit. Be a little bit haphazard with the brushing, so you don't have to walk me like brush for 45 minutes. At least give you an idea of what I'm going to that I do here. Again, because I rimlet them, it makes it a lot easier to pull the exposure of them out because I can brush into the rim light, whereas before I'd have to be really particular about not letting the brush go into the doorway. Okay, and I'm gonna lower my flow a little bit. Oop, looks like that happens. Okay. And I'm just kind of brush this in a little bit and let it bleed into the ground. I still want there to be some shadows there. So that's looking good enough for now. I wouldn't like brush onto this door, but it's gonna be good for what we're doing. Okay. I'm also going to raise the shadows a little bit, bring in a little bit more detail in his face. Something like that. And now I'm going to do a warm dodge. I want to kind of sell the idea that this is sunset, and it sort of is the sun, but the sun's coming from left to right, and I want to kind of make it look like it's coming from behind to kind of tie into the rim light on them. And so I'm going to use my gradient tool, and I'm going to select warm dodge, and I'm just going to drag this all the way up here, something like that. Now I don't really want to raise the exposure, I just want the warmth of it. And then I'm going to do subtract brush, and I'm just going to brush it off of the subject here. I like the warmth that it's adding to the chapel, and then I don't want it here on the ground. These bushes here, let's try to flow up a little bit more so it can go faster. Normally I would keep a low flow and like brush it in slowly, but again, for sake of time. Okay, now I like what's going on here, but I want to add a little bit more to the sky and a little bit more to the chapel. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this mask. Now I like what it's doing to the chapel here, but I'm going to get my erasing brush for this new one, and I'm going to brush it away from the sky because I want to be able to adjust the sky and the chapel independently from one another. So like that's looking good. I'm going to now add a little bit of saturation, a little bit more contrast, something like that. Okay, and now on the original mask, I'm going to duplicate that again. And then now I'm going to brush away what's happening here to the chapel. So now I'm only messing with the sky. I'm going to add a little bit more warmth and maybe raise the exposure up just a little bit. So you can see before and after for that, and then a before and after for just the chapel. Now, the last thing that we need to do to really kind of sell this sunset look is get rid of these like highlights on these trees. And so I'm going to create a new mask. It's going to be a brush, and I'm going to use the highlight burn, but I'm also going to lower the exposure a little bit. And again, I'm going to be really dirty with the brush here, but I'm really just going to brush over these highlights here. Blend them in with the shadow here. Okay. And that exposure is a little bit too much, but kind of in that general area is looking good. The last thing I'm going to do is this hotspot down here is a little bit too much. So I'm going to drag a gradient up, but I'm going to use the cool burn, and so that's going to add a little bit of cool details to the bottom while also taking care of some of this bright edge down here. So that's looking good. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, so this is kind of a tough situation. This entire chapel is being lit with candle lights, and then the chapel also has these like LED panel lights that are off to the side. But she's standing in front of the panel lights. So the panel lights are giving her this really nice rim light. And she also has this really nice catch light in her eye that is, kind of showing off the emotion that she's having. And so what I need to do is I need to kind of maximize the dynamic range here. So I need to pull out as much detail from her face as I can, while also making sure that the highlights on her rim lights don't blow. And they're kind of already getting pretty close here with kind of some of these specular highlights. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to crop out these candles on the edge. I'm going to put a little bit of a tilt. That's going to get rid of that little guy right there. And then I'm going to apply Queen's Gambit. And then I'm going to take care of these highlights with two highlight burn gradients. So I'm going to drag a gradient here across her face, and I'm going to say highlight burn. And then I'm going to do another one across this highlight. You can probably hear my kids screaming. That's going to be highlight burn for that one as well. And then now I'm going to raise my exposure all the way up until those highlights kind of start getting in the general area that I want them to be. So maybe in there, let's white balance around where I want it, maybe something like that. And then now I'm going to get my brush tool and I'm going to bring out some of the detail of these shadows with the shadow pull brush. I'm just going to brush directly over all of this shadow area. And again, it's only going to affect the shadow. So you can tell like I'm going into the highlight area, but it's not affecting and raising the highlights or anything like that. It's just really pulling out all the detail here within the shadows. And I can bring out, some of this, actually I'll do it with a lower flow here. Bring out some of the detail here and into her jacket a little bit, but that's looking pretty good. And then now I can kind of fine tune. I might raise the exposure up just a little bit more, something like that. And then I want a little bit more something on this edge of the frame. It's a little too dark. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a gradient from the top edge, and I'm going to do just a warm dot because there's already kind of like all of this light and stuff coming from that area. So it makes sense that there would be a little bit of kind of like flare and color coming in. Now, again, rather than messing with all of the sliders and stuff, I'm just going to drag a big gradient and then I'm going to pull it back until it looks like where I want it to be. So maybe somewhere in this area is good. And I might just add a little bit more of a turn here just to, I turned it the opposite way than I needed to because she was looking like she was leaning. That's looking pretty good there. Okay. So again, key detail for this one is the highlight burn and the shadow pull, just to kind of bring all those variations on her face kind of closer together so that you can still, the highlight of her face didn't go out, but then you can also still see all the detail and that catch light within her eyes. And just for an example, here is what happens if I didn't have that highlight burn. So that whole side of her face would go super, super hot. Okay. And so this gradient brings that way into control. You're moving along. This is a fun one. This is a portrait literally just in the middle of the street. Any old street in any old neighborhood. Here's like a street light over here. There's a car parked on the side of the street. There's a fence. There's a car parked right here. But what's happening is I am backlighting them with a flash with a full CTO gel. And then I'm also backlighting them with a Stella Pro Reflex S, which is a constant light. And so the flash freezes the subject and freezes the rain. And then the constant light is on for the entirety of the exposure. And I'm shooting at 1/13 of a second. And so that's why when you zoom in here, oh, I can't do that when I'm at that. When you zoom in here, you can see the streaks of the rain in the background. And that's from the constant light. But then that pop of flash freezes them and the rain as well. But because I have a full CTO gel on the flash and not the constant light, there's also two different color temperatures of light behind the subject. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply Queen's Gambit, and then I'm going to drag this slider all the way down to cool, and then I'm going to zoom in on their faces, and I'm going to adjust the white balance until their skin tones are about where I'd want them, and I still want their skin tones to be a little warm. So maybe somewhere in this area is looking good for me. Now, one thing that I did before the live is I pasted on the AI generative fill that I did for this image just so that we didn't have to wait for the panel, but I want to show what I did there. So basically the light is firing from behind them. They're standing on a puddle, but that puddle is going to complete white. So real quick, one of the things that I did for this image is I did a highlight burn just on the bottom here just to take care of all of these highlights. So something like that. But even with the highlight burn, there was this area that was just totally white. And so there wasn't any detail to bring back. So this little area that's just completely white, I just did a generative fill on that little section of blown highlight just to kind of fill it in with some detail. Okay. Now from here, I did a background pop AI, which is going to add just saturation and contrast to the background. I'm going to even raise the exposure up just a little bit more and maybe even cool it down just a little bit more just to get a little bit more of that separation. I might actually do, I don't think I did this on the first one, so if you're watching this again, I might do another highlight burn here. That, and now crop, straighten this guy, and I'm just going to crop out that street lamp and just center them on the frame a little bit more. And then I'm going to get the brush tool, and I'm going to use the shadow pool just here on their faces. Bring out some of the detail here within the shadows. And now the backlight here and some of this glare is kind of eating up some of the contrast. And then also whenever you're pulling detail out from the shadows, you're minimizing the contrast. So in order to help alleviate that, there's contrast built into this brush, but always feel free to just add a little bit more if it looks like it needs it. So the situation I'll be kind of in this area, I think. Okay, so that's looking good. The only other thing I would do here is probably just clone out this little headlight, and maybe you can kind of a little bit see the license plate to this car, so I just clone that out, but we're gonna skip that part. Okay. Next image is going to be this one here. I'm gonna do Queen's Gambit. I'm gonna zoom in on her face, and I'm really just going to look at the white balance and exposure for her face, and I don't wanna get distracted by anything else. So zoomed in, I'm gonna raise my exposure, and I'm gonna try and find that sweet spot where you can see a lot of details of the highlights, but that little hot spot of light on her eye. And I'm going to be overly bright. And I also might do the shadows a little bit higher. Okay, good. Okay. And then I'm going to do a background burn AI, even though we're not actually going to use the settings. Again, I'm just doing this as a quick way to add a mask that has the subject separated. I'm going to click on that. I'm just going to remove the gradient, because I only want the full subject separation. And then on the presets of this, I'm going to select blackout, and I'm just going to black out everything that isn't the subject. And then I'm going to zoom in a little bit here for a quick crop to get her closer to the third, while keeping in mind that I don't want her hat to be too close to the edge here. And then the last thing I'm going to do is her shoulder down here is just a little bit too bright for me. I don't want blackout for that. I just want to drop the exposure down like half a stop. And then the last thing I think I did here is just a quick brush tool with the background pop. And I'm just brushing over her necklace here just to give it a little bit more contrast and saturation. And then as well as like, don't breeze up on me now, her hat here. Kind of like some of those warm tones, give it a little bit more contrast on those jewels. call that image good and move along. Here we have kind of the ending of a high school senior session. I'm bobbing in the water, so that's my excuse of why the frame is so tilted. But what we're gonna do is add Queen's Gambit. I'm going to add a little bit of a straighten here. I'm gonna raise the exposure up just a little bit. And I wanna keep all of these like cool tones, but I want this like sunset to be more warm. But I don't wanna affect the cool tones of like the shadows and stuff in the boat. So I can't just drag a gradient here. But what I can do is I can create a mask and I can say select the sky. I'm going to apply the warm dodge to all of the sky. And then I'm going to click on that mask and I'm going to subtract it with a gradient. I'm going to subtract down something like this. Okay, again, so just bringing some warmth and pop a little bit more because it's a little bit brighter behind him. Okay. Moving along. This is from the same high school session. So the senior is standing in this field. Behind him in this little pocket is actually the lake. So I'm shooting this at 85 millimeters because I want to fill this in with just lake water. If I was closer, then you'd actually be able to see like the shoreline and stuff like that. But because it's now past dusk, it's like in the blue hour area, I'm shooting at 1/6 of a second, which is a slow enough shutter speed for me to be able to get a sharp image if I don't move my camera. But it also gives me the ability to move my camera if I want to. And so that's what's happening here is the flash is firing. It's freezing the subject, and then I have a little bit of time within that to move my camera and get some streaks. And so kind of like these little bits of lake that you can see through the trees, those are streaking through the frame to kind of give me what looks like these like light beams that are coming down through the trees here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do Queen's Gambit. I'm going to raise my exposure up a little bit to something like that. I want to warm this up a little bit so that those leaves are a little bit more like warm and glowing how they were, but I still want to keep some of those blue tones. So somewhere right about in there's looking good. Now I don't need to worry about skin tones in this situation because he's essentially just like a rim-lit silhouette. So I'm just going to crank up my contrast a little bit because of the shutter drag thing that I'm doing here. It's eating up some of the contrast. I'm going to add a little bit more contrast in just with the contrast slider here, and then I'm going to raise my saturation up like that. I want to get rid of this like dark area, so I'm just going to hit M for my my gradient tool. I'm going to drag up there, and I'm just going to raise the exposure up a little bit. Matches the rest of the frame. And then I don't want all of this warmth down here to be so bright. It's really pulling an eye, so I'm going to hit M for another gradient tool. I'm going to bring that up, and then I'm going to select highlight burn, just to really bring back all of the highlights there within that area. Just something like that is looking good. Okay, moving along, 3 more images. If you've stuck around with me this long, then congratulations. So again, Queen's Gambit. I'm gonna zoom in on her face here. I'm gonna raise my exposure until everything is looking good. Maybe somewhere in that area. It's looking a little bit saturated here on the transitions from highlights into shadows, and so I'm going to click Subject Decline. And that's looking pretty good, so I'm going to zoom out. There's a little bit of the background dropping in there, so I'm going to crop that out. And then her dress and veil are a little bit bright, so it's like it's pulling my eye away from her face. So I'm going to do a gradient tool, cool burn. I'm just going to drag that up. So that's looking good. And then I'm going to do, again, I'm going to do a warm dodge. Drag that all the way down. And I'm going to do it real big, knowing that it's way too much. And then again, rather than mess with the sliders, I'm just going to drag this and bring it back. Only catching the bits that I want. So somewhere in area is looking good. And I'll just add a little bit more of a tilt to it, like that. So that looks good for me there. A couple more. Again, I'm going to zoom in here. Queen's Gambit decline, or Queen's Gambit. Going to raise the exposure up for just her. Corner up here is a little bit distracting, so I'm just going to crop that. And that actually centers her up a little bit, so I'll keep it going until she's centered. Straighten her a little bit. Now this edge over here is a little bit bright and distracting, so I'm going to use the Cool Burn. That area, just to kind of minimize that. And then I'm going to use the Warm Dodge. And then again, I'm going to make it real big. Dial it back by pulling it to something like last one is of my son playing in the trees. Now the initial idea for this one is for him to be a silhouette as he's climbing this tree in this little window that's being framed by the trees and the bushes around. Now the foot placement ended up being perfect, but I can't actually see his little face here. And so when I'm doing a silhouette, especially when it's people, I want to make sure that I can see the full silhouette of their profile. So because of that, even though I was shooting it for a silhouette, I'm going to actually I'm going to bring out all the detail here. So this is the A7C-R, which is a 60 megapixel sensor that has like 15 plus stops of dynamic range. So I have tons of detail in the shadows here. And then also tons of room to crop. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise the exposure here. Let me zoom in on his little face. I'm going to raise the exposure. Mess with the white balance until that's looking good for his skin tones. Warmer. It's looking pretty good. And now I want to crop out all of this grass. I want to crop out these hot spots on the edge and then this hot spot up here on the top left. So with my cropping tool, grass, bring that into about there. That's looking good, about like that. I think I want it to be just a little bit warmer. Now I'm going to do background pop AI just to really make all of these leaves super saturated and poppy. So background pop. Again, I don't want it to affect the skin tones. So that's looking good, but I'm going to raise the shadows a little bit to bring out some more of the detail within those leaves. All of the colors. And now the sun's kind of setting behind him. So his foot is kind of looking a little bit bright and hazy, and it's pulling my eye away from him. So I'm going to use M for my gradient tool, and I'm going to do Cool Burn, and I'm just going to bring it up like that. And actually that's affecting the skin tones a little bit too much. I might actually just get rid of the coolness of the white balance. And I'm going to raise the shadows a little bit so you can see what's inside these leaves more. That is looking good to me. Okay, so that's it. Look, yeah, so we just went through 15 different photos using the Grandmaster Series. If you have any questions, obviously drop them in the comments. The preset pack is on sale for Black Friday if you're watching this in time to get the best sale of the year on the preset pack. If not, it won't go on sale probably until the next Black Friday. But I'll leave links in the description to purchase that if you would like. If not, hopefully at least kind of some of these editing techniques were of use to you, as well as, you know, some of the way that some of these images were lit or taken and things like that. But as always, I hope you found this useful, and I'll catch you on the next one.